Hello everyone, I hope you did okay with the challenge for part 1, and we are now going to dive into part 2. So in this part of the project I'm going to show you how to write your own simple animations using another component. And instead of the animation mixer component that we used in part 1, we're going to use a component that's just simply called animation. So the first thing we have to do is, of course, import the animation component into our project. And I made that very easy for you by putting the script element that you need just right here on the page for this project. So you can just copy it and paste it right in. And you want to paste it, of course, into the head element of your project. So now in my head element, I've got 3 scripts. One brings in a frame. Another one brings in that animation extra, the animation mixer component. And the third one, this new one, is our animation component. So my goal is to put a few animations on this simple new scene I have. And I just started this off with a few boxes. And if you want to grab these boxes to animate them just as I'm doing, just go ahead and copy and paste these box elements into your project, and then you can go right for it. Okay, now when a lot of people think about animation, they're thinking, oh my gosh, movement, like animating is moving something around. And it's true that you can animate something's position, and we are going to do that, but you can animate lots of things, right? You could animate something's rotation so that it spins around. You could animate something's color so that it changes from one color to another in a smooth kind of transition way. So don't be limited, you know, it's not just position. But we are going to start off by doing position. What I want to do, I kind of want to make my boxes like hover up and down a little bit, like a cool little hover effect. So I'm going to show you how I would do it. Now, first, as you might have guessed, we have to add the component to the entity that we want to animate. So as we know from before, we do that with an HTML attribute. You just add the name of the component to the entity as an HTML attribute, right? Just like position, rotation, or whatever else. Now the name of the component we're adding is animation, so we're just going to add animation to our element. I'm going to go ahead and bring this right in here. Okay, now if you refresh your project though, you'll notice that nothing really has changed. Okay, it's still looking just as it was before. So that's no good, right? You might be thinking, well, why isn't it animated already? And the reason for that is just because we have animation on the entity, it still doesn't know what you're animating. It doesn't know how you want to animate it. It needs to be configured a certain way. Now, animation mixer, that worked before just when you added it just like that, because it had kind of default behavior that in that case happened to do exactly what you want. But animation itself doesn't have any default behavior. You need to configure it, right? You need to give it a value. Just as you gave position a value, right, with equals blah, 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 and rotation has a value. Animation, you need to configure it with some values. So let's do that. Now, how do you find the ways that you can configure this animation component? Well, you can check out the documentation for the component on its GitHub page. Right, I also found this component on GitHub. So go ahead and click the link on the page, and it'll take you to the GitHub page for this component. And if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a section called API, which means Advanced Programming Interface, and you'll see a list of all the different ways you can configure this component. Now you'll see a lot of things that don't make any sense. Some of them still don't make sense to me. That's okay, I'm learning more about this component all the time. But the way to kind of make sense of this is on the left you have the different properties. And then in the middle, you have a description of what that property means. And then next to the description, you'll see a column for default value. And this is kind of what the value will be of that property unless you set it to be something else. So these default values are actually kind of important because unless you customize them, this is what that value will be. Okay, so that's all fair enough. And now we know that these are the different ways we can kind of customize our animation component. Okay, now, as I said before, I want to put a little hover effect on the animation. So where do I set that? I mean, if I want to make something hover, I'm changing its position. So I know that the position is what it is that I want to animate, right? It's not color, it's not rotation, it's not something else. I want to animate its position. So I see here one of the properties is actually called property, which is kind of confusing, but bear with me. This is where you set the property that you want to animate. It can be a component name. Now I know I want to animate that position component. So I think I can set this property now to at least let the component know that I'm going to be animating its position. So let's do that. And the way I would do it is like this. Now we know to set an HTML attribute, you use equals and then quotation marks, right? Like we've been doing with position and scale and so forth. So go ahead and do animation equals and then quotation marks. And then in the quotation marks, go ahead and put the name of the property, colon, and then the value that you want to set for that property. Now I know this is a little confusing because in this case, the name of the property itself is property. So that's why it says property there, but it's okay. We've got property, colon, and then the value that you want to set for that. In this case, we want to animate the position. So I'm going to put in position. Okay, so name of the property, colon, and the value you set. And then make sure you, of course, end the quotation marks. Now, the component now understands, right, that I want to animate the position of this box, but it doesn't know where I want to move it to, right? It doesn't have a target, kind of like a final destination, right? It wouldn't know where to hover to. So I'm thinking, well, how do I figure that out? I'm kind of looking through the documentation, and eventually I see that there's a property called to. And I'm looking in the description, it says this is the target value at the end of the animation. So that's what I want, right? I need to set that to property to set where my animation is going to move to. So to make a little hover effect, right, I want my box to be able to move up just a little bit. I need to change it on the y-axis, right? That's that vertical axis. You remember we went over position in project 1. So to do this, just go ahead and add the to property to the animation component. Now, when you have more than one property, you separate them with a semicolon. That's why I have this semicolon here, right? Here I've got the first property, semicolon, and then I've got the second property. And so I say to, and then colon, and then I set, okay, this is the destination position. This is where I want it to animate to. Notice that it's the same as the position, except instead of 1 for the y value, I've made it 1.5. So fingers crossed now, but this should make my box just move up by 0.5, right? So I've set those two. Now I experimented with a few more properties, right? I saw that there was one loop that makes it repeat. So it says if the value is true, the animation will repeat. Well, I want my hover to go on and on, so I went ahead and set loop true. And I set this one dir for direction. I set direction to alternate so that it goes back and forth. Okay. So, you know, a lot of this was kind of trial and error. I was sort of experimenting. I was thinking, oh, that sounds kind of, I'd like to see what that does. So I experiment with it, and, you know, eventually you discover what they mean and you learn how to use them. So this is what I ended up with. Got animation equals, and then I have all of the different properties that I'm setting, the name of the property and a colon, and then the value that you're setting, and all of those properties are separated by semicolons. And here I have it, right? My boxes are in fact they have a nice little subtle hover on them, which is pretty cool. Okay. Now, let's go beyond position, though. Let's animate something's rotation and color. I want to make my boxes spin and hover, and I want them to change color. Okay. So you can add as many animation components as you want to any particular entity. All you have to do is name them differently using a little underscore. So instead of just having animation equals, if you want to have more than one, have animation underscore, and then give your animation a name. And they can be whatever you want. I have these names. You don't need to use my names. These can be any names you want, so long as they're different from one another. So I've got animation underscore hover, which is where I'm going to have my hover animation. But I've also got animation underscore spin, which is going to be different, and then also animation underscore color. And you can put all of these on the same element. All right, so my spin, instead of property position, this is where I'm going to be animating the rotation. So I've got rotation as the value for that. And for its destination, I have it 0 and then about 1,490. So it's going to spin around a bunch of times. For color, I've got property, right, color. It's not position or rotation. I'm going to be changing the color. And I'm going to have it animate to the hex value for this orange color. So I put all of these on both of my boxes. I also added a tetrahedron to my scene, and I've given that a fade animation if you want to see how I did that. Here's all of the code for that. And I encourage you to kind of play with this, change the values around, just copy and paste these right into your project if you want, and then adjust some of the values to see how that affects the animation. So you see now these boxes have 3 animations on them at once, right? They're hovering, they're rotating, and they're changing color. Okay, I hope you've stuck with me. I know this code can look a little intimidating when you first see it, but take it apart piece by piece, and I think you'll actually be able to make sense of it, right? This long line is just a list of different properties and their values, right? And they're all separated by semicolons. So it looks scary, but it's the kind of thing where, well, once you're able to make sense of it, you're able to make sense of it, and it'll be just fine.